Tamir was the type of person that you could always depend on. Long as the people around him was taken care of, that's all he cared about.
Tamir and Rodney was like total opposites.
Everything with Rodney was a joke. He never really took nothing real serious.
Tamir always tried to just play the big brother role to Rodney.
Rodney, he embraced that street life.
I'm under arrest? Yes, for what?
Rodney didn't care about nobody but Rodney.
At the end of the day, my heart was shattered in a million pieces.
It's summer 2021, and brothers Tamir and Rodney enjoy a day out with their family, making social media videos at a water park.
I have 7 children. Me and my kids did everything together. Tamir was 3 years older than Rodney. For the most part, they got along, but they was the typical brothers.
Tamir always been like the clown, like he always been funny.
Why you got the hat on? Because it's green?
Tamir would make you laugh and smile all the time.
Rodney, I call him like the aggravator. He just like to mess with people. I mean, we was a big family, so it was always fun.
Tamir Dial Hale is born on January 2000, but his parents separate soon after his birth.
Shortly after the pregnancy, we kind of broke up, and we never got back together. We just raised Tamir together.
Tamir was a happy-go-lucky little baby. Like, he was a joy to have. Everybody in my family loved Tamir.
He was a mama's boy. He was sweet. My 5th child, Rodney, was born November the 8th of 2003. I don't think it made a difference that they did not have the same father, because I feel like my kids grew up knowing they had the same mother. The boys fought. My house was always loud because I had more boys than girls. They argued, they disagreed, and then they was right back playing together. I feel like they was normal kids and they loved each other, but of course they had disagreements. Tamir's a good brother. He was a really good brother.
Like, he wanted us to do the right thing and stay on the right path and just be like our best selves.
He was my little brother, but he was like a big brother. He always been a protector.
When Tamir is 12 and Rodney is 8, their family gets even bigger when Pinky gives birth to her 7th child, Jeremiah.
When I got pregnant with Jeremiah, I think everybody was upset. I think everybody was like, we don't want no more kids here. Tamir and Jeremiah were buddies. All of them was really pretty close, though.
But as Tamir and Rodney become teenagers, their lives start to go in very different directions.
Rodney was always wanting to be tough. Tamir and Rodney was like total opposites. Tamir learned at a young age that you gotta hustle to get money. He would shovel snow, he would cut grass. He never tried to go down the street life road. But for Rodney, he embraced that street life, the street culture. That was what he wanted for himself. Tamir always talked to me about how he would talk to Rodney and try to get him to turn his life around. And he like, Pops, he just ain't listening to me. I'm like, ain't nothing you could do.
Tamir always tried to talk to Rodney about doing the right things, but it went in one ear and out the other. Once he got in high school, he was determined, and he would tell me every day, Mom, I'm doing this for you. You want me to have a diploma? I'm gonna get it.
I was extremely happy when Tamir graduated from high school.
Rodney didn't really start misbehaving to maybe about 4th or 5th grade. He didn't want to be in school, and he was very disrespectful to teachers, and by 12th grade, he just completely dropped out. It was hard raising teenage boys all together, but Rodney was definitely the one that gave me the most problems. As siblings growing up, When Rodney was at home, he was a normal person. We would all sing together. I think Rodney put on a persona for the streets.
This me, Rodney, and my friend. This was around the time me and Rodney spent a good amount of time together. We used to go to the rec after school sometime and just be kids. I love that video. It's me, Rodney, and Rodney in that video. It was like a little TikTok trend. It was funny. That's another TikTok of me and Rodney comparing like our features. I had to force him to do it because people always said that we looked alike a lot. I don't really think Rodney had like any long-term goals. I think he just lived day by day.
Rodney couldn't keep a job because Rodney had did so much bad things in the streets. Rodney would shoot at people and people would shoot at Rodney. Rodney was scared to go certain places because of who he might run into. Tamir worked with me at the market hall. We were cleaning the building. But when Tamir came, he made it fun. He would laugh. He would be the highlight of everybody's day.
This video, we was at my mom's house. Tamir was watching my kids that day, and I had came back early, and they was under the cover. He was telling them a story.
Once upon a time, there was this thing called a story. And back in the day, people told the stories, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And I just started recording, because I thought it was so cute. He was a real present uncle.
Tamir's first impression was always good. Even when my friends met him, they would just be like, "Your brother's so nice, he's so sweet." He was kind of flirtatious too.
When me and Tamir first started chatting, it was through Instagram. Tamir just started putting heart eyes on my pictures, telling me how beautiful I looked and stuff like that. In the messages, he was like, "You're cute," and I'm like, "You're cute," and I'm just like, "Let's be cute together." We went on our first date in December of 2020. We went bowling. My first impression of Tamir was that he was really down to earth, like a very caring man. Tamir described Rodney as his younger, annoying brother that he loved. He would do anything for Rodney. The first time that I got on the phone with Tamir, Rodney came into the room. He pretty much did say, "Shut up," pretty much. And I was just like, "Who are you talking to? I don't have to shut up." And Rodney told me, "I will be out you." Rodney was definitely one of them boys that I would say I stayed away from. Rodney loved guns. He made it very clear that that was the life that he lived and the life that he loved to live. You never know what a person could do.
As he had gotten older, he was not a person you would really want to be around. Rodney didn't care about nobody but Rodney.
I think the whole family felt as if Rodney did have a problem. I believe that if you mix with the wrong people, bad things are gonna happen. Tamir was working at a cleaning job at the Market Hall, Shaker Heights, Ohio. Hey! I ended up going to his house and meeting his mom and his family, and then we were inseparable.
When Tamir first met Nina, it was fast, and she instantly moved in with us.
Nina became a part of our family. Like, I grew to love her like a sister.
Me and Tamir, when we met, we started talking about kids roughly like 6 months in. It was fast paced.
We having a baby! We're having a baby!
When Tamir found out I was pregnant, he was ecstatic.
Look at my baby real quick. What's up, Daddy Chicken Dumpling?
He was phenomenal throughout the pregnancy. Tymer never missed a beat when it came to our child, ever. He swore it was a boy. I knew it wasn't no boy. And I looked at him, I said, "You're gonna cry when it's a girl."
It's fall of 2021, and 21-year-old Tymer and 19-year-old Nina throw a gender reveal party for their family and friends.
We all just came out to see what he was having, and he was determined to make sure that a truck had whatever color powder come out.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
When the pink smoke came out, Tymer was mad. And he made a comment and he said, "That's okay, Nina, we gonna run it back."
It was the funniest thing, because I was like, dude, you don't pick your kids. Your kids pick you.
Rodney didn't show up to the gender reveal, but I think Tymer understood that his brother was in the streets and not family-oriented like him.
Rodney just didn't care. He just had this kind of like, "I don't care if you like me or not" attitude.
At only 18 years of age, Rodney is also about to become a father.
Rodney wasn't as excited as Tymer was to become a father. Rodney was just, "Oh, it is what it is. She's pregnant, you know." Rodney's son's mother, they wasn't in a relationship. I think Rodney probably wasn't as excited because Rodney didn't have anything. He didn't have a job. I don't think Rodney was prepared to care for a child.
Rodney was the type of person to get angry very quickly. You say one little thing to him, and he's going from 0 to 100 in a second. When I was pregnant, Jeremiah and Rodney were having a disagreement. And Jeremiah was so much younger than him. So I intervened, and I did tell Rodney, "Stop, that's your little brother." Rodney did not like that. Rodney got in my face, threatening me, screaming in my face. I was fearful of him. Because, for one, he's a man, and I'm pregnant. And for two, the aggression, the look in his eyes, he's angry. I think Tymer and him, they were cool after it. You know, they're brothers. I would never try to get between brothers. I didn't talk to Rodney for a couple months. Me and Tymer decided that we wanted to move into our own apartment because, you know, it was time we started our own family, began our own life. Me and Tymer moved into my apartment October 15th, 2021. I went into labor with Alani February 15th. Tymer was just there the whole time, rubbing my back, talking me through it. We did end up doing an emergency C-section. He was there through it all. Tymer was the first person to hold her.
Cheers.
First time that I seen Tymer really cradle Nalani and really get in father mode, it warmed my heart. He did most of the nurturing. He did the most of the getting up in the middle of the night, always made the bottles, changed the diapers, because he knew that I was healing.
Look, right here. I'm your daddy. Yeah.
Lonnie loved her dad. He was a wonderful, wonderful father.
You should have seen him with her. He was amazing.
Rodney's day would consist of sleeping the majority of the day and then going outside. So when you got your child, you can't just sleep all day and then go outside. I just don't believe Rodney was ready for a child. Sometimes I would be like, you know, get him. But he would get his son and be so frustrated. He didn't care what I said. He was running with the wrong people.
It's March 2022. Tymer and Rodney's younger brothers are driving through the city at night.
Tymer's younger siblings, Rondell and Jeremiah, were all in a car together with Rodney's girlfriend. and the car was shot up.
I looked back to check on Jeremiah. I said, Jeremiah, are you okay? But when I looked back, he was laying on the floor and he had blood on the back of his head. At that point, I knew he was hurt, but I just didn't know where. So I called 911, and they came fast. Not even 2 minutes fast. It was like 5 cop cars and an ambulance. They pulled him out the car, laid him on the ground, cut his clothes off.
Jeremiah was shot. He was struck in his chest and twice in his legs, and he was grazed 3 times. Jeremiah should have never had to experience nothing like that. I believe that they thought that Rodney was in that car, and I believe that they maybe had a run-in prior to that, and that was the outcome of it. Jeremiah was 10 years old when he was shot. He was in the hospital for a week, but he was okay. He didn't suffer any major damage. Tymer was really hurt by it, and Rodney was really hurt by it because Rodney felt like it was for him. He kept saying that he wished he'd have been in the car. We always told Rodney, you need to put the gun down. You need to do something better with your life.
Tymer definitely expressed to Rodney how he felt that he should try to change his life, but Rodney just didn't want to hear it.
Rodney was disrespectful. He didn't care what I said. No matter how much I chased him, no matter how much, he did not care at all.
I feel as if Rodney was consistently putting his whole family in danger. Rodney was a ticking time bomb waiting to go off.
As he got older, Rodney did become more violent. I don't know what it was that made him become that way. An image he had to portray, or if it was just really who he was.
I do think that sometimes Rodney did think that Tymer was my favorite child. It's not that Tymer was my favorite or that I loved him more, but he was a little bit more responsible.
Me and Rodney got into it at my mother's house. It started over something petty, and he said that he was gonna go put his gun up and come back downstairs and hit me. And that's what happened. He came downstairs and he hit me, so I hit him back. I remember the police pulling up and they arrested both of us, and we both was in jail together.
When I found out that Rodney did put his hands on Yana and they were both in jail, I knew then that he didn't care about anything. I knew then that he could harm someone. I stayed away from Rodney for the most part for a couple months. I just felt like I didn't want me or my baby around that.
But Tymer is busy focusing on his career and providing for his family.
Tymer started working security at a school, at a charter school. He would come home every day with a story, and he would just be so excited about how he impacted some child's life.
He was a security officer at the school with me. He was a natural. Like, the kids loved him. They really, truly loved Tymer. I believe that Rodney had some type of jealousy or envy. I believe he was probably jealous of Tymer's whole life.
Rodney got in a lot of trouble, but it's hard to just say, oh, I give up on my child, because he is my child. I guess I was just being a mother and thought that that was the right thing to do, to just still love him regardless. I think Rodney wanted my attention, so he would get it anyway, even if it was in a negative way.
In July 2023, Wickliffe Police Department received another 911 call about Rodney.
911, what's your emergency?
Hi, my daughter is at the Green Ridge Hotel, and her ex-boyfriend showed up, and he has a gun on him. He shot her car up recently.
What is his name?
His name is Rodney Curley. He's just harassing her.
So she said that he has his gun. Did he show it to her?
Yes.
Rodney called me and asked me to come pick him up from a hotel. Once I got close to the hotel, I seen a bunch of police cars. And from what they said, he beat her up in the hotel room. Somebody called the police and said he had the gun.
Stop walking. Turn around, face away from me. Turn around, face away from me. Oh, that's cool. Bring your hands behind your back. Bring your hands behind your back. Come on, don't.
So the police stopped him and he didn't have the gun on him, but they took him to jail because she had a knot on her head. She was pregnant with his second child.
You can sit back down first. You're gonna sit back down. You can see me through the window.
I want to
Okay.
stand by here.
Okay. But if you're not gonna comply, we'll charge you with obstructing too. I'm giving you a lawful order. You're under arrest. You're going to sit back in the car.
I'm under arrest?
Yes, sir.
For what?
Put your feet back in the car.
For what, though? So,
I was like, who is that? You know, every time. So he was a little jumpy. Probably about 3:30, 4 o'clock. I dropped Rodney off at the old house. When I got back to the old house, Tamir and Nina was pulling up. She said she had to work, and I'm like, I'll take the baby. When I got to the new house, Tamir came with the air conditioner. It was fairly hot. Tamir said, I'm gonna take this air conditioner upstairs. And Rodney says, don't take all that stuff upstairs. You wasting our time. And Tamir was like, stop talking to me. He went upstairs. They go back outside and they're in the U-Haul. But now they're arguing like really arguing.
(911). Do you need police, ambulance, or fire? (911). Do you need police, ambulance, or fire? Hello?
A boy just shot a boy right here on our street, and the boy is on the ground.
Where's the person who shot him?
He's gone. He ran.
The 911 call came in on October 3rd, 2023 at 6:51 p.m. There's a lot of chaos going on. There's screaming, there's crying, there's yelling. We learned that a boy shot another boy.
Come here right now! Come here right now! He shot him over here first! Okay. They was right here! Okay. He's moving his stuff like they started. He said you a your gun. He said I'll pop right now. He shot him right now.
The victim was in dire straits. They had recognized multiple gunshot wounds. He was not conscious.
I didn't feel pulse.
Okay, Michael, can you start getting like info on the witnesses real quick?
The first person the officer encountered is the victim's mother. The first thing that she conveyed to that officer was that one of her sons had just shot her other son in front of her.
Here's your son.
Yes,
Okay.
the killer is my son too.
Okay.
Yes, he shot him face to face, like up close.
Right.
He jumped
and then
up there,
he came out of the
and then he jumped. Then he ran up to U-Haul and stood over him and shot him.
So I see the blood.
Yeah. They're arguing here. She said, they're arguing. He says, you're a without your gun. And he says,
The victim said that.
Yeah, and he said, I'll pop your ass right now. Shot him. Yeah, brothers.
Really?
Yeah.
What's the suspect's name? What'd she give you?
Rodney Curley.
We learned that the suspect in this case was 19 years old, that our victim's name was Tamir Dial Hale, and that he was 23 years old.
When I got the call from my mom, I think she was screaming on the phone, saying Rodney killed Tamir. And when I got there, Tamir was laying on the ground in the neighbor's front yard.
As Tamir is rushed to University Hospital, family members arrive at the scene.
That's my other daughter right there. He's gone.
Okay, son was shot.
When Pinky called me, everything just started going like fireworks in my brain. Is my baby father alive? Did he kill his brother in front of my child? Did he harm my child?
She's down there on the other side of the crime.
What people got her?
My daughter was with some woman that lived on the same street. They had said Timer had a pulse. So we were all hopeful, you know. I was just praying.
When I get there, yelling at the police, like, where's my son, where's my son? The police was like, we took him to University Hospital. I jumped back in the car and I sped off. I just remember falling on my knees praying to God.
When the homicide unit arrived, we do a walkthrough through the crime scene. We discovered that there was a shell casing inside the moving van, and there was multiple shell casings outside, along with a blood trail that led from the moving van to the final resting place of Tamir.
Hi.
Hi.
How are you doing? You okay?
Oh.
I know.
Police speak to Pinky to find out what actually happened.
It's like one son killed my other son. It's like, I don't even know what to think. I don't even know really how to feel. I don't know what to do.
It was unbelievable. I'm standing right next to Tamir, and Rodney says, I don't fight, I shoot.
So I'm like, come on, y'all. Like, I just got this house yesterday. I don't want y'all arguing, being a drama. We ain't even in the house yet. So the baby came out the door. She was standing there. He said, I swear on your daughter, I'll kill you.
He just pulled a gun out and shot him. He shot him in his shoulder. It was unbelievable. Tamir's face went from, I don't think he would shoot me, to I can't believe he shot me. Now Nalani is screaming, and Tamir turns to jump off the U-Haul. So I go to try to like grab Rodney, but he jumped too. But as he's jumping, he shot 3 times. When I finally did see Tamir, he was laying on his back in the grass, and he would just kept saying, okay, bruh, basically begging for his life. And Rodney shot him. And now my mind is telling me to grab Rodney, but then my body was like running toward Tamir. Tamir flipped his body over. So now he's laying on his stomach. And he shot him 3 more times. Rodney turned like to me, and I ran around the other side of the U-Haul because I felt like he would shoot me. He was running down the street, and I laid on the ground next to Tamir, and he
didn't have to kill him, though. He didn't have to do this to him.
This family has seen a lot of tragedy at the hands of this individual. It was imperative that we got him in custody as quickly and as safely as possible.
So the key now is that we need to talk to him, right?
Find him.
Yeah, and make everything safe. As safe as we can. Do you have any idea where he might be?
She was able to give us a couple of locations where Rodney may have fled to. She didn't know the address, but she provided a screenshot of a map that may be the location or the area that he fled to. That information was immediately disseminated to the officers out on the street.
That's another thing, he limping. He hit his knee when we was at the old house.
Okay.
He hit his knee on the U-Haul. Definitely limping.
I want to explain to you guys, while we're sitting here talking to you, there's at least 20, 30 guys out looking for him.
Okay, he's
what do you...
Please try to find him tonight, because if he pointed the gun on her, he can get another clip and come back.
Yeah.
So after we leave the scene, we try to...
Man, the whole city, the whole community came out. Like, it was amazing.
The hardest part was seeing him in the casket, because it's like, once they bury you, you're gone forever. It was hard to deal with that. It was hard giving him my last kiss.
On November 16th, investigators make a breakthrough in their hunt for Rodney.
Rodney was found to be hiding out in a house in the city of East Cleveland. As as soon as Rodney understood that the K-9 unit was coming in the house, he came out of the basement and gave himself up. Less than 2 hours after the fugitive unit arrested Rodney, he was in the interview room with Detective Legg.
So do you want to share your version of the events or tell us what happened that day that led to whatever happened happening?
I'm telling him, like, bro, stop. Like, now, then that's when I said something. I'm like, bro, stop crying like a bro. You've been crying like a all day. Stop crying like a I'm like that. He looked down, he see my gun.
Mr. Curley was claiming self-defense. He was claiming that our victim, Tamir, had a gun on him, which there was zero evidence of and zero history of, by the way.
So he looked down and see my gun. So he instantly rushed me. Like, he tried to rush me with this hand. For me, his left hand. He had a gun like this. He grabbed my gun. So my gun fall out, push it. I up. He tried to go like this. Then the gun had fell. I grabbed it. I was like, it fall down my leg. So I was pushing it up like this. And once he seen me going for my gun, he did like this. And then like I just tapped that gun. From mind, I had a switch on my gun. I ain't gonna lie to you. So like, feel me? He gun shot. Like it went off.
Then he was claiming that there was a tussle over his gun, between the two of them. Mr. Curley was, forgetting at some point that his mother was standing right next to him when this was going on. We don't care what they say as long as they're talking to us in there, because I can prove what he's saying is a lie just as easily as I can prove that it's the truth.
Because there was only 3 people there that day. Me, my mama, and him. Stories between 4 people, me, him, my mama, and God.
Sure.
So no matter what I tell y'all, you can't tell y'all what happened.
Right.
Only she be the one telling y'all what's going on. So, like I tell y'all what happened tonight, y'all still gonna believe it.
He was feeding us a lot of malarkey, trying to, in his mind, trying to justify the things that he did. At the end of the day, a self-defense claim is not going to work in this particular incident at all, given just the physical evidence that we have. His demeanor while being interviewed was evasive. He was mumbling. He was aware that he was being recorded. We tell everybody that we're talking to in there that you're being audio and video recorded. He had his hoodie up over his head for that reason. And again, was evasive in his answers. It wasn't until he was given a little bit of the case that we did have that he put himself there.
Oh, listen, Mr. Curley. They found the Glock 19 at the house. Is that the one you had?
What Glock 19?
At the house they arrested you on.
No, I didn't. I don't.
He also came up with this self-defense nonsense, which is what it was, because he had nothing else. The medical examiner's office determined that Tamir had 16 gunshot wound defects in his body, and it was labeled a homicide. He didn't seem in any way, shape, or form remorseful. He was in self-preservation mode.
I'm fighting my whole life. I've been the black sheep in the family my whole life. Like, I was always the distant one. You feel me?
Mr. Curley wanted to blame everybody but himself.
The autopsy highlights the severity of Timer's injuries and the brutality of the shooting.
The medical examiner's office determined that the cause of death was multiple gunshot wounds. That can be an entrance defect or it could be an exit wound. He had 16 holes in him, which is indicative of an intentional infliction of harm. In the course of the investigation, we learned from Pinky that Rodney Curley Jr. had been seen. She's known him to have several different types of guns. She described a gun with...
I didn't know how to do what everybody wanted me to do. I felt like maybe if he felt my pain from my words, it would hit him that this is reality. I believe that that was when he realized that he had destroyed his family.
I let us, but I'm sorry. Now it's they gotta take it back and redo it.
He genuinely apologized in that moment. Now, if it was genuine, I don't know, but in that moment, it felt genuine. I couldn't tell him I hated him. I couldn't, because I don't hate him. I hate what he did.
This is my victim impact statement that I didn't get the opportunity to read to the judge in front of the monster that was sitting in the court. I'm here for my son, who was the best child you could ask for. He was loved by everyone. The only enemy he had in life was in his own household. What the killer did to me was rip my heart out.
Rodney is sentenced to 23 to 28 years in prison.
Rodney absolutely committed a monstrous act. There's nothing worse than killing your brother in front of your mother, in my opinion.
I cry every day. That hurt. Everybody in my family is devastated by this.
Tamir was everything to me. Tamir was my best friend. I miss everything about Tamir. I don't forget Rodney.
I would tell Rodney, if I could talk to him right now, you took my daughter's father away. You stole him from her. I wish you could have just walked away. You didn't care about anybody but yourself. Tamir made his mark on everybody. He was a real leader in man form. I don't think that I'll ever meet anyone like Tamir.
The road into western Kansas looked, at first glance, like the kind of road where nothing truly evil could happen. It stretched beneath a pale November sky in a thin, steady line, cutting across fields that had already given up their harvest and now lay exposed to the season like skin without a coat. The wind moved low over the stubble, dragging dust in soft gray ribbons along the ditches. Telephone poles marched beside the highway with a patient rhythm, one after another, receding into a horizon so flat and open it felt less like land and more like a held breath. Out here, in the final weeks of 1959, the earth seemed to promise a simple order. Men worked, families gathered for supper, church bells rang on Sundays, doors were locked only when people remembered to lock them. The dark, when it came, was not expected to hide anything more sinister than cold, and yet there are nights that stand at the edge of history without anyone noticing. There are evenings that begin with ordinary gestures, a lamp switched on, a pie set to cool, a schoolgirl brushing her hair, and move silently toward catastrophe with such calm inevitability that the world does not understand what has been lost until morning. In Holcomb, Kansas, the morning would come like frost over glass, revealing something rigid, final, and impossible to reverse. Holcomb was not the sort of place that inspired suspicion. It was small, unadorned, and practical, a settlement shaped by wheat, cattle, weather, and routine. The town did not sprawl so much as gather itself. Grain elevators rose above the plains like blunt monuments to labor. Farm trucks left tracks in dirt lanes. Porches held metal chairs that creaked in the evening. People knew the weight of one another's names. They knew who had recently fallen ill, whose son was doing well in school, whose daughter played the piano in church, whose corn had come in late. Privacy existed, but it was a modest privacy, made of courtesy rather than distance. People could leave a screen door swinging and trust that no danger would step through it. If a stranger appeared on a road after sunset, someone would notice. If a dog barked in the night, a light might come on in a nearby house. Holcomb lived by familiarity, and familiarity can feel so much like safety that it becomes indistinguishable from innocence. That was part of what made the coming violence so unbearable. It did not only shatter one household, it injured an entire idea of America, the quiet rural promise that decency and hard work could build a life strong enough to keep horror outside the fence line. At the heart of that promise stood the Clutter family. Their name carried weight in Finney County. Though not the loud, theatrical kind that invites envy from a distance. It was the heavier kind, the local kind. Built over years of discipline, reliability, church attendance, business judgment, and visible effort, Herbert Clutter was known as a man who had earned what he had. His farm was prosperous, his reputation orderly, his habits exacting. He did not drink. He did not smoke. He dealt fairly. He expected standards from himself and from those around him. In another part of the country, such a man might have been dismissed as stern, or distant, or difficult to please, but in Holcomb, those qualities translated into steadiness. He represented a kind of upright Midwestern competence people admired because it seemed durable. He believed in systems, in schedules, in doing a thing correctly the first time so there would be no need to revisit it later. The world made sense to men like Herb Clutter because they spent their lives forcing sense upon it, row by row, account by account, season after season. His household, from the road, reflected the same composed order. The Clutter home stood on River Valley Farm with the calm authority of a place built to last. It was large without ostentation, comfortable without softness, prosperous without flamboyance. The yard was kept. The outbuildings served their purpose. The approach to the house held none of the theatrical grandeur of wealth. It carried instead the clean, almost moral neatness of people who believed bourgeois disorder was a form of neglect. Inside that house, however, life was not simply a portrait of rural success. Like every family, the Clutters contained their own weather, their own unspoken distances, their own small tendernesses and disappointments. And that complexity is where the story begins to tighten, because the dead are often flattened by tragedy. They become symbols, headlines, a last name repeated in newspapers. But before they were victims, they were living people moving through a Saturday with separate thoughts in separate rooms, carrying private worries that had nothing to do with the violence already traveling toward them in the dark. That Saturday, November 14th, did not announce itself as important. It arrived like any other autumn day on the plains, with a hard morning light and the thin bite of cold that slips under doors and through coat sleeves. Somewhere a truck engine coughed to life. Somewhere coffee steamed in a kitchen before dawn. Cattle shifted in pens, hooves thudding softly in the chill. Farm work waits for no one. And life in western Kansas often begins before the sky fully decides to brighten. Yet even in that discipline, there are domestic pauses. Moments of almost invisible grace, breakfast plates gathered from a table, a girl checking the mirror before leaving the house, a woman moving slowly from room to room with the careful energy of someone trying not to drop her thoughts. The Clutters, each in their own way, were moving through such a day. Nothing in the light suggested that by the next sunrise, the house would no longer belong to the living. There is a particular terror in crimes that bloom inside places associated with comfort. A highway at midnight can feel dangerous. An alley can feel dangerous. A deserted bar after closing can feel dangerous. But a family home in the middle of open country, a home with curtains, dishes, children's rooms, and Sunday plans, seems protected by the simple fact of being home. The Clutter house carried that illusion with heartbreaking force. It was the kind of place where one might imagine hearing a radio low in the kitchen, a horse in the barn, footsteps on stairs. The ordinary orchestra of family life. One can picture the warmth of lamplight on polished wood, the slight smell of laundry, the whisper of wind against windows. These details matter because they frame what was stolen, not merely 4 lives, but the entire atmosphere around them, the confidence that domestic space is separate from predation. After the Clutter murders, people across the country would look at their own homes differently. Locks began to feel meaningful, night sounds developed teeth. And somewhere beyond Holcomb, beyond the fields and the church-going habits and the confidence of a quiet county, two men were moving toward that house. They were not ghosts. They were not legends. They were flesh. Thought, memory, resentment, appetite, and bad luck shaped into human form. One of the most unsettling truths in violent crime is that catastrophe rarely approaches with thunder. It arrives in a car with gasoline fumes and road dust on its frame. It carries cigarettes, old grievances, cheap plans, an uneven pulse of desperation. Evil often looks tired before it looks monstrous. It sits at roadside diners. It asks for directions. It folds maps. It glances at clocks. By the time a community understands what has entered it, the engine has already gone quiet and the men have already stepped out into the cold. This is what makes the Clutter case so enduring, even beyond the brutality that would soon define it. It feels like a collision between two Americas that had no business meeting. On one side stood structure, labor, faith, and the belief that a life could be secured through discipline. On the other stood drift, bitterness, fantasy, and the restless violence of men who moved through the country carrying damage inside them like a hidden blade. The distance between those worlds was not measured in miles. It was measured in values, in habits, in what each side believed a human life was worth. On that November night, those worlds would meet not in debate, not in warning, but in a farmhouse bedroom with the curtains drawn. Before the blood, there was silence. Before the headlines, there was weather. Before the investigation, there was a plain black sky pressing itself over Kansas, star-crowded and pitiless. The farmhouse windows held rectangles of light against the dark. Then one by one those lights disappeared. A family settled in. A son did not sleep there that night. Two daughters were away from the house. 4 members of the household remained. Herb Clutter, his wife Bonnie, their teenage daughter Nancy, and their son Kenyon. Their final hours were threaded through with routines so ordinary they now seem sacred. A horse to be tended. Lessons to think about. Small plans for Sunday. The invisible architecture of a life that assumes tomorrow will arrive in its usual shape. There is something almost unbearable in imagining how calm the rooms must have felt. No raised voices, no premonition hanging in the air. Just a family inside a respectable Kansas home, under blankets, behind walls, believing in mourning. If one stood far enough back, the farm itself would have seemed untouched by menace. The outbuildings would be dark shapes against darker ground. Bare trees would scratch lightly at the night. Wind would move through wires with a thin metallic hum. The roads would lie mostly empty. The town itself already folded inward for sleep. In places like Holcomb, darkness does not pulse with urban noise. It widens. It deepens. It makes isolated houses feel like ships. And isolation, so often cherished as peace, can in the wrong hour become exposure. The Clutter home was prosperous, admired, visible by day. By night, it stood alone in a sea of land, and that solitude, which had once felt like dignity, was about to become vulnerability. The story has been told many times, but its power remains rooted in a simple, dreadful contrast. The victims were not dragged into criminal underworlds. They were not caught in gang rivalries, smuggling routes, or a long chain of revenge. They were at home. That fact stripped away the comforting lie that violence belongs only to certain neighborhoods, certain people, certain reckless choices. The Clutters were not marked by scandal. They were not living on the edge of obvious danger. They were, in the American imagination, exactly the kind of family thought safest, which meant that when the details emerged, the fear spread far beyond Kansas. People heard not only about one murdered family, but about the fragility of every lamplit window in every small town where parents believed distance from the city meant distance from evil. Yet the deepest darkness in this case is not only what happened, it is the cruel asymmetry between the victims' lives and the motives of the men who came for them. The Clutters had built, worked, planned, saved, worried, hosted, repaired, and carried themselves through the seasons with all the ordinary seriousness of people invested in tomorrow. The men approaching them carried almost none of that patient investment, their thoughts bent toward opportunity, grievance, money, and the ugly thrill of forcing reality to answer fantasy. That imbalance gives the case its special horror. So much life on one side, so little conscience on the other. A family built over years, a decision made in 9 hours. A home shaped by routine and care, a crime assembled from rumor, ego, and greed. Some murders feel like explosions after long pressure. This one feels, from the distance of history, like an invasion. And so part 1 begins where all unbearable stories begin, before anyone in the house knows it is the last quiet night of their lives. The plains lie cold under the moon. The roads keep their secrets. Holcomb sleeps with the confidence of a place unaccustomed to locks and suspicion on River Valley Farm. A respectable family rests inside a home that has never learned to fear the dark. Far away, tires whisper over Kansas pavement, drawing closer mile by mile. In another hour, another stretch of road. Another turn. The line between ordinary life and irreversible violence will vanish. By dawn, the Clutter name will no longer belong only to neighbors, church friends, schoolmates, and business ledgers. It will belong to sheriffs, reporters, courtrooms, and the permanent machinery of American true crime. But for now, the house is still only a house. The night is still only a night. And evil, not yet visible, is already on its way. There is another reason this opening must linger before the door is opened and the violence begins. Murder stories are too often consumed backward, as if the dead exist only in relation to the method of their deaths. The Clutter case resists that reduction. To understand why this night still echoes, one must stand for a moment inside the world that was about to be erased. One must feel the restraint of small-town manners, the polished certainty of Sunday clothes laid out in advance, the smell of starch and supper, the fatigue that settles after chores, the private loneliness that can survive even in good families, the vulnerable trust that grows wherever kindness has gone unpunished for a very long time. The opening is not delay. It is respect. It is the last chance to see the house as the Clutters saw it. Not as photographs would later frame it, not as evidence, but as shelter, not as a crime scene, but as the center of a family gravity where each room held its own pattern of life. A kitchen where practical things were done without fanfare. Bedrooms where youth and adulthood coexisted uneasily under one roof. Hallways crossed by familiar footsteps. A bathroom mirror reflecting the ordinary face of a teenage girl preparing for church, school, friendship, and the future she expected to outgrow her hometown. All of it still intact. All of it minutes away from becoming a memory that the nation would inherit only after it had been broken. Even the land seems complicit in that pause before disaster. The fields do not warn. The barns do not speak. Frost gathers where it always gathers. The dark keeps its shape. Somewhere a dog may lift its head and settle again. Somewhere a train horn may carry across the flats and fade into distance. Nothing announces that history has chosen this address. That, perhaps, is the cruelest part. The world does not tremble before innocence is destroyed. It remains outwardly calm, almost beautiful, while human intention moves beneath it like a knife under cloth. Long before the murders turned Holcomb, Kansas, into a name spoken with a shiver, it was a place that seemed almost deliberately designed to resist drama. The land lay open so completely that secrets felt unnatural there. Wheat fields stretched in disciplined rows across the plains. And when the wind traveled over them, it created the illusion that the earth itself was breathing in its sleep. In late autumn, the harvested ground looked stripped and honest, exposed beneath a high, pale sky that gave little shelter and offered no sentiment. Distances were not merely seen in western Kansas, they were felt in the body. They lived in the time it took to drive from one farmhouse to the next, in the way a storm could be watched advancing from miles away, in the silence that settled after sundown when the last truck had passed and the radio had been turned low. To outsiders, such a landscape could appear lonely. To the people who belonged to it, the openness was a kind of moral condition. It encouraged hard work, directness, and endurance. The land did not flatter anyone. It demanded effort and repaid it only when effort was steady. Holcomb had grown within that logic. It was not a town of spectacle. It was a town of repetition, habit, crop cycles, school functions, church suppers, and the small public rituals that allow a rural community to keep recognizing itself from year to year. There were grain elevators, railroad tracks, modest homes, farm roads, and businesses that seemed less like institutions than extensions of local memory. People remembered who had lost a father, who had married young, who had survived a bad harvest, who had built something from almost nothing. In such a place, reputation was not an accessory. It was a second skin. A person's name traveled ahead of them, carried in talk over counters, at football games, after service on Sunday, at the post office, at the school gym, and around kitchen tables where coffee was poured before the coats even came off. The Clutters were one of those families whose name moved through Finney County with a special kind of firmness, not glamour, not aristocracy, not the brittle authority of people who wanted to impress, but something more durable. Their name suggested order. It suggested a farm run properly, bills paid on time, children raised with expectations, and a household structured around discipline rather than mood. Herbert William Clutter embodied that impression so completely that to many neighbors he seemed inseparable from it. He was not simply a successful farmer. He was the type of man rural America often elevates into an ideal without ever quite saying so aloud. He was industrious, controlled, temperate, civic-minded, and serious about responsibility. He had built River Valley Farm into a substantial and admired operation, and in a county where prosperity could vanish under bad weather, failed markets, or poor judgment. That meant something. It meant not only that he had worked, but that he had worked correctly. Herb Clutter did not live carelessly. He was known to abstain from alcohol and tobacco. He followed routines. He kept records with precision. He was active in community and church life, a respected figure whose discipline could inspire confidence and, depending on who was being honest, a little unease. Men like Herb often create stability for everyone around them. But the stability comes at a cost. It requires standards, and standards cast shadows. In public memory, especially after tragedy, Herb can seem almost too upright, too neatly representative of post-war American virtue, but the truth was more human. He was admired, yes. Yet admiration is not the same as intimacy. He could be exacting. He could be emotionally reserved. He did not fill a room with warmth so much as with structure. He believed things should be done in a certain way, and he had spent years proving that his way often worked. River Valley Farm reflected him. The property was prosperous, modern by local standards, and carefully managed. It did not advertise luxury, but it carried unmistakable signs of success. The house was substantial, comfortable, and intelligently organized, a home shaped by practical prosperity that had grown from the soil rather than fallen from speculation. The farm itself was not a romantic spread where life drifted in golden sunsets and easy abundance. It was a working enterprise. Feed had to be bought. Equipment had to be maintained. Livestock had to be watched. Harvests had to be planned with a cold eye on weather and costs. Yet because the Clutters managed these realities so well, the place acquired an aura of calm. Things functioned. Fields produced. The household held. In a region where survival often depended on competence, competence itself could begin to look like grace. But every household, no matter how orderly from the road, contains interior weather the neighbors do not fully see. Bonnie Clutter, Herb's wife, occupied a far more fragile emotional terrain than the family's public image suggested. She had once been lively, socially active, and deeply involved in the life of her home. But by 1959, she had long struggled with severe depression and periods of mental and physical debility that had changed the rhythm of the household. Her suffering did not announce itself in dramatic public scenes. It lived quietly inside the house, altering patterns, reducing her ability to manage ordinary tasks, reshaping the family's emotional balance. Illness of that kind often isolates not only the person afflicted, but the entire household around them. Others begin to adapt by instinct. Children lower their voices. Spouses become more logistical, less spontaneous. Rooms take on new meanings. A bedroom can become both refuge and border in the Clutter home. Bonnie's condition meant that the family's image of perfect order rested over a more complicated truth. There was pain there, fatigue there, and the sort of silence families develop when they are trying to move gently around a wound that never fully closes. This did not mean the house lacked love. It meant love had been forced to change its posture. It had become practical, careful, subdued. The Clutter children were part of that world, shaped by both privilege and restraint. Two older daughters, Beverly and Eviana, were no longer living at home. Their lives had begun to move outward, as adult children do, creating the first spaces in a family that had once been more crowded. Left in the house that November were Nancy, 16, and Kenyon, 15, each standing in that uneasy, bright corridor between childhood and adulthood where personality sharpens quickly and parents begin to realize they no longer fully know the private country inside their children. Nancy Clutter, by nearly every surviving account, seemed to embody the kind of promise communities love to claim as their own. She was intelligent, organized, attractive, and active in school and church. She was the sort of girl who did things well, not noisily but reliably. She helped teach a neighborhood child to bake. She participated in activities. She maintained friendships. She seemed, from the outside, to move through life with the composed ease of someone already practicing for adulthood. But girls like Nancy are often misunderstood by the communities that praise them. Their competence is admired so quickly that their inner life becomes invisible. Everyone sees the polished surface, the smile, the schedule, the willingness, the clean dresses, the social grace. Fewer people notice the pressure beneath it, the subtle fatigue of always meeting expectation, the private wish to be seen as more than the sum of one's usefulness. Nancy lived in a house shaped by order, in a town that rewarded composure, under a father whose standards were firm and a mother whose suffering drew quiet concern. Her life was full. But fullness is not the same thing as ease. Kenyon Clutter, younger by a year, seems in recollection almost to inhabit a different emotional light. He was mechanically gifted, quieter, more inward, a boy whose hands liked tools and whose attention fixed naturally on making, adjusting, building. If Nancy represented social fluency, Kenyon represented concentration. He was the sort of boy who might be most comfortable when occupied, when his mind could narrow to the clean logic of parts fitting together. In many families, siblings divide themselves this way without ever intending to. One moving toward people, the other toward objects. One more visible in public, the other more difficult to read. Yet both remain tied to the same household gravity, the same routines, the same weather of expectation. On River Valley Farm, Those routines mattered. They gave days their structure and gave the family its rhythm. Morning rose early. Work was not optional. Meals had their place. Chores had to be completed. School and community obligations layered over farm life, creating the particular busyness of a household that is never doing only one thing at a time. In urban memory, the 1950s are often reduced to polished nostalgia. Bright appliances, pressed clothes, smiling families under warm kitchen lights. Rural life on the plains was more demanding. Comfort existed, but it was earned again and again. A clean shirt might follow hours of labor. A pleasant dinner might be framed by market worries and physical exhaustion. The Clutters were prosperous enough to stand out, yet they were not removed from this reality. Their competence did not exempt them from the ordinary burdens of weather, livestock, teenage uncertainty, marital strain, illness, and social obligation. If anything, prosperity increased the pressure to maintain appearances, to keep the machine of family life running smoothly enough that outsiders would notice only its efficiency and never its friction. Holcomb itself reinforced that pressure. Small communities can be tender, but they can also be exacting in ways that are difficult to name. Because everyone is known, everyone is also being interpreted. A family like the Clutters could become a local benchmark without choosing to be one. Their household might be discussed not only for what it was, but for what it represented. Success, stability, Protestant self-command, American possibility rooted in land. Such symbolism can be flattering, but it is also isolating. It leaves little room for disorder, weakness, contradiction, or pain. Bonnie's illness did not fit the symbol, neither did adolescent complexity, or emotional distance, or any quiet sorrow not easily translated into church language and neighborly approval. The late 1950s formed an important backdrop to all this. America was rich in its self-image then, or wanted to be. The war was over. Consumer confidence was rising. The language of national life was full of forward motion. Yet beneath that surface, anxieties were everywhere. The Cold War, the bomb, class aspiration, shifting values, private loneliness hidden inside idealized domestic images. In places like Holcomb, those tensions took on a quieter form. People believed in order because disorder threatened too much. They valued decency because the world beyond the plains seemed to be moving faster, growing stranger, becoming harder to recognize. The Clutters stood as proof that the old virtues still worked there. They were exactly the kind of family Americans wanted to believe still existed across the heartland. That is why the case would later strike with such force. They felt like an assault on a national myth, but before the myth was shattered, life on River Valley Farm still moved according to season and habit. That Saturday carried its own small plans and familiar motions. Nancy had social obligations and domestic tasks. Kenyon had projects, interests, and the inward focus of a teenage boy who could lose time inside his own work. Herb managed the farm and its demands. Bonnie drifted through the day with the limitations her illness imposed. Each family member inhabited the same house differently. That difference matters. Family homes are often imagined as single emotional units, but in reality, each room can hold a separate universe. The father in one room is thinking about money or weather. The mother in another is thinking about endurance. The daughter is thinking about the next school event, a dress, a friend, the shape of her future. The son is thinking with his hands. They meet at meals, in passing, through brief exchanges. But their private worlds remain partially sealed even from one another. The Clutter home was no exception. It contained not one life, but several, joined by surname and routine, separated by age, temperament, and private thought. Outside the house, November pressed toward winter. Trees had gone bare. The fields looked flatter, harder, almost metallic in certain afternoon light. Sunset came earlier now. And with it, that prairie sensation of darkness arriving not from above alone, but from every edge of the land at once. Lights inside the house would grow warmer by contrast. A window seen from a distance might shine like an act of faith against the flat Kansas dark. There is something haunting in that image now, because we know what those windows contained and how little protection walls can offer when violence has made up its mind. But the people inside did not know. To understand the Clutter murders only as an event is to miss their deeper emotional architecture. The crime became notorious because it was brutal, yes, but also because the setting seemed so resistant to brutality. It happened in a place where trust had not yet been fully embarrassed. It happened to a family whose life suggested the enduring strength of discipline and community. It happened in a home where pain already existed, but not the kind that prepares anyone for homicide. The farmhouse stood as many farmhouses did, grounded in labor, tradition, and ordinary hope. The family inside was imperfect, respectable, burdened, striving, and alive in all the ways that never survive newspaper shorthand. Herb was more than a civic archetype. Bonnie was more than an invalid presence on an upper floor. Nancy was more than a pretty popular girl. Kenyon was more than a quiet boy with technical gifts. They were individuals moving through a Saturday evening under one roof, carrying separate thoughts toward the same night. The setting around them was beautiful in the severe way Plains country can be beautiful. All spare lines and enormous sky. All distance and discipline. It is the contrast that gives the coming violence its force. Without Holcomb's quiet, the murders are only savage. With Holcomb's quiet, they become desecration. Without the Clutter's public standing, the crime is terrible. With that standing, it becomes symbolically devastating. Without the hidden strains inside the home, the family risks becoming a postcard. With those strains acknowledged, they become real people, and their loss becomes heavier. That is the world on which the story rests. A small Kansas community shaped by weather and memory, a respected farm family carrying both pride and private difficulty. A house lit against the prairie dark, and a country still eager to believe that decency, land, and hard work could keep certain nightmares far away. Before the Clutter family became a case file, a headline, and a wound in American memory, they were 4 separate centers of gravity inside one household, each carrying habits, preferences, anxieties, and quiet forms of love that made the home feel inhabited in ways outsiders could only partly understand. That is the hardest truth in any family murder. The dead are remembered first by the violence that ended them, when in reality their lives had been built from thousands of gestures so small they never expected to be noticed. A breakfast plate left by the sink, a pair of work shoes by the door, a brush set down on a bedroom dresser, a hand on a banister in the dark, a voice calling from another room. On River Valley Farm, those gestures belonged to Herbert Clutter, Bonnie Clutter, Nancy Clutter, and Kenyon Clutter. They were not symbols while they were living. They were a father, a mother, a daughter, and a son moving through the private weather of a Saturday in November. Each one carrying the familiar burden of being ordinary and loved. Herbert Clutter, known to nearly everyone simply as Herb, stood at the center of the family's public identity. To neighbors and business associates, he represented solidity. He was the kind of man whose name suggested a pressed shirt, a balanced ledger, a punctual appointment, and a life arranged according to principle rather than impulse. He had built his success through discipline, and discipline showed in everything around him. He did not need to raise his voice to establish order. His standards had weight because people knew he applied them first to himself. He was tall, lean, composed, and exacting, a man whose manner could seem reassuring or forbidding depending on where one stood in relation to him. To the community, he was respectable in the fullest post-war sense of the word. To his family, he was both provider and structure, the figure around whom the household organized itself, not because he demanded constant attention, but because his expectations shaped the air in the house. Men like Herb often speak most clearly through routine, rising early, checking the practical details others overlook, moving from one task to the next without theatrical complaint, treating waste as a moral flaw, measuring success not by display, but by what continues to function under pressure. It is easy, after a crime, to turn such a man into a monument, but monuments do not eat supper, worry about children, or glance at weather with a farmer's instinctive concern. Herb did those things. His authority was real. But so was his humanity. He was not simply a stern patriarch in a newspaper story. He was a person who had spent years converting effort into stability, trying to secure a future for the people inside his house. Bonnie Clutter lived within that same house under very different conditions. By 1959, she had endured years of depression and periods of severe physical and emotional collapse that had changed the role she could play in family life. There had been a time when she was vivid, engaged, social, and deeply active in the household. Illness had narrowed that life, pulling her away from the easy center of domestic movement and placing her instead in a quieter, more painful orbit. People who visited the house might have sensed delicacy around her, a certain caution in tone, the slight adjustment families make when one member is fragile and everyone else has learned to compensate without openly naming the compensation. Her suffering did not announce itself with noise. It settled into the rooms like low winter light, changing mood, changing rhythm, changing what could be expected from a day. Yet to describe Bonnie only through illness would also flatten her. She was still a mother, still a wife, still a woman whose inner life did not disappear just because her illness made her less visible in the public and practical functioning of the home. There is a loneliness particular to mothers whose families continue to move around them while they struggle to move within themselves. The house goes on, chores are completed, children age, meals happen, farm business continues, and somewhere inside that continuity sits a woman aware of what she can no longer fully give. Bonnie's story carries that ache. She belonged to the family not merely as a figure of sadness, but as one of its emotional roots, someone whose diminished presence still shaped every other presence around her. Nancy Clutter, 16 years old, was in many ways the brightest outward face of the household. She was admired in town not only because she was attractive, but because she seemed to combine beauty with purpose. She was active, dependable, sociable, and competent in the kinds of ways adults find especially comforting in the young. She was involved in school and church life. She was the kind of girl trusted with responsibility because she had already shown she could carry it gracefully. There are teenagers whose charm feels loud and self-asserting, and there are others whose presence seems to gather approval almost without effort because they radiate a studied but genuine composure. Nancy belonged to the second kind. She helped people. She kept up appearances. She seemed to understand the small social obligations that hold a community together. Her life contained all the ordinary textures of adolescence in a small town: friendships, classes, domestic tasks, future hopes, the subtle awareness of how one is seen, and the private negotiation between obedience and selfhood. The danger in remembering a victim like Nancy is that admiration can turn her into a porcelain image, all sweetness and promise, too polished to feel fully alive. But living girls are always more complex than the photographs left behind. Nancy may have smiled easily, but she also lived under expectations. She was a daughter in a prominent household, a young woman watched and praised by a community, old enough to imagine the future and young enough to still be shaped by the rules of the house she lived in. She likely knew the fatigue of being thought capable by everyone, the invisible pressure of being useful, pleasant, and composed even when one wishes to retreat. What survives of her suggests brightness, but brightness is never the whole story. There would have been private moods, fleeting irritations, moments at the mirror when she saw not the admired local girl, but a self still forming, still uncertain, still tender in places no one else could see. Kenyon Clutter, 15, carried a quieter energy. Where Nancy's life seemed braided into social currents, Kenyon's appears more inward, more technical, more attached to things he could build, repair, and understand with his hands. He was known to be mechanically inclined, a boy whose attention settled naturally on materials, tools, and processes. There is a particular solitude to adolescents like that. They are not necessarily lonely, but they often inhabit themselves differently, drawing satisfaction from focus rather than from display. A shop, a workbench. A project taking shape under careful hands can become a language more comfortable than conversation. Kenyon seems to have been that kind of boy. Not absent, not cold. Just turned slightly away from the social stage on which his sister moved with such ease. In family life, these differences can balance each other. One child brings outward warmth and connection. Another brings concentration and internal steadiness. Parents learn each child through different doorways. The home, if it is fortunate, makes room for both. Kenyon's presence in the Clutter House matters precisely because it rounds out the family's reality. They were not a tableau arranged for public admiration. They were a living unit composed of unlike temperaments, unlike needs, and unlike kinds of vulnerability. Herb's order, Bonnie's fragility, Nancy's poised brightness, Kenyon's reserved competence. These qualities did not cancel one another out. They formed the emotional architecture of the home. It is possible, standing back from the story, to imagine a typical day there in fragments. Herb moving with purpose through the practical concerns of the farm, carrying in his body the schedule of weather, livestock, accounts, and obligations. Bonnie upstairs or in a quieter part of the house, managing herself through fatigue or melancholy, conscious perhaps of sounds below her that signaled life continuing without her full participation. Nancy crossing rooms quickly, balancing school responsibilities with household tasks. The hem of a dress shifting as she moved, her attention already split between what she had just done and what still needed to be done. Kenyon occupied with some mechanical interest, his concentration narrowing the world into solvable pieces. These are not dramatic images, and that is exactly why they matter. Family life is made from repetition, not climax. Affection often reveals itself not in speeches, but in the persistent return to one another's needs. Someone asks whether a task is finished. Someone notices that another person is tired. Someone leaves food. Someone reminds. Someone waits. The Clutters, like any family, would have contained tensions within that repetition. Herb's discipline may at times have felt heavy. Bonnie's illness may have placed emotional strain on the household. Nancy and Kenyon, as teenagers, were likely already looking toward futures that extended beyond the farm and beyond Holcomb's watchful familiarity. Yet those tensions do not diminish the family bond. They deepen it. Because real families are not harmonious in every moment. They are simply committed to continuing together through moods, silences, misunderstanding, and ordinary fatigue. One of the cruelest dimensions of the Clutter murders is that they interrupted a family in the middle of becoming. Herb was still building and managing. Bonnie was still living inside the uncertain terms of her illness. Nancy was still unfolding toward adulthood, one of those small-town girls whose future might have led toward marriage, college, teaching, motherhood, another town, or a life no one around her had yet imagined. Kenyon was still at that age when skill is emerging faster than identity. When a boy may seem half-formed one month and strikingly self-possessed the next, none of them had reached the end of themselves. That incompletion is part of the tragedy. Murder does not simply end life, it severs possibility. It leaves every ordinary plan suspended in midair. The father who means to handle next season's work never reaches the next season. The mother who has not stopped suffering also never has the chance to heal. The daughter who is admired for her future is denied that future entirely. The son who has only begun to understand what his hands can make is never allowed to become the man those hands were preparing him to be. In that sense, the victim's story is not only about who they were on the last day, it is about the future stolen with them. The Clutter family also mattered to one another in ways that outsiders could not fully measure. Public reputation records behavior, It does not capture the texture of attachment. It does not tell us how Herb's footsteps sounded to the children at night. Whether Bonnie's voice had softened on certain evenings, whether Nancy and Kenyon shared easy jokes or lived at that teenage distance where siblings circle each other through affection disguised as practicality. It does not preserve the exact warmth of a kitchen on a cold evening, or the way a house settles into itself after supper, or the shape of trust that accumulates over years in a home where each person knows where the others will likely be. Trust is one of the hidden victims in family homicide. Inside the Clutter house, trust would have been woven into every room. They slept because they believed night was still divided from danger. They moved through their home with the unthinking confidence families develop in spaces made familiar by repetition. The coming violence would not merely destroy bodies, it would shatter that trust so completely that the whole country would feel the break. To tell the victim's story honestly is to insist on their daily reality before the crime swallowed it. Herb was not just a prosperous farmer found bound in a basement. He was a man who had spent a lifetime making order out of uncertainty. Bonnie was not just a bedridden woman murdered in her room. She was a person whose suffering had already made life difficult long before violence entered the house. Nancy was not just the pretty daughter whose death seemed especially heartbreaking to newspaper readers. She was a vivid young woman whose competence, social grace, and private interior life had made her beloved and perhaps burdened in equal measure. Kenyon was not just the son in a separate room. He was a boy in the unfinished process of becoming himself, carrying a quiet intelligence that rarely leaves loud traces in public memory. Together they formed a family that looked, from the outside, almost exemplary. From the inside, they were what all families are. A complicated arrangement of love, role, habit, strain, duty, and tenderness. That is what stood inside the Clutter home on the last evening. Not a symbolic American unit, but a real one. A father with expectations, a mother with pain, a daughter with promise, a son with skill. A house filled not with dramatic speeches, but with the small, unnoticed acts by which people belong to one another. This is why the murders still feel like more than a crime. They feel like an erasure of intimacy itself, the violent cutting away of 4 private worlds that had every reason to expect another morning. When the story later reached the public, the Clutters became famous in death. But the moral weight of the case rests in the fact that they never sought any such attention. They had been living quietly, specifically, locally, in the only ways that matter while life is still being lived. The fields around their home did not know their names. But their family did, the rooms did. The routines did, their dog did. Their neighbors did, the church pews did. The school halls did, the farmyard did. The kitchen chairs did. Their lives were embedded in place, in custom, in repetition. To understand the horror of what happened next, one must hold on to that embeddedness. One must see them not as bodies awaiting discovery, but as living presences moving through the final ordinary hours of a November Saturday. Each of them still entirely themselves, still inhabiting the story of a family that believed it had time. And perhaps that is the most haunting part of any victim's story, the normality of the final evening. A lamp switched off, water running in a sink. A curtain drawn, a door closed with no fear behind it. The mind of each person leaning towards tomorrow's tasks, none of them standing at a window. Sensing that the darkness outside contained intention, none of them suspecting that history was already walking up the path toward their home. Night arrived over River Valley Farm with the kind of quiet that makes every small household sound seem larger than it is. The wind moved across the fields in long, cold passes, rubbing through the dry remains of the season and brushing the sides of the outbuildings with a faint papery hiss. Inside the Clutter home, the routines of Saturday evening went on as if the world were still bound by the same rules it had followed the week before and the year before. Light settled warmly on walls and tabletops. Floors held the familiar creak of footsteps that never needed explanation. A door opened, then closed. Water ran briefly through pipes. Somewhere in the house, a drawer slid shut with that modest wooden sound every family stops hearing because it belongs so completely to the texture of home. Nothing about the evening announced itself as final. That was the cruelty of it. The last hours of ordinary life almost never look important while they are happening. They pass in errands, habits, half-finished thoughts, and domestic details too small to preserve. Yet later, after the blood, those details become sacred because they are the last true record of people still living inside the boundaries of expectation. For Nancy Clutter, the evening still belonged to the future. She had spent part of the day in the social rhythm that framed her small-town life, moving through obligations and conversations with the easy reliability that made adults trust her. By night, she was back inside the house, within the circle of things she knew by touch and memory. She was 16, still close enough to childhood for home to define her world, yet old enough that the future had begun to gather around her in visible outlines. There would have been school concerns, friends, church, clothes set aside for tomorrow, the quiet, private inventory of a teenage girl preparing for another ordinary Sunday. Kenyon, in his own way, was closing out the day as boys of 15 often do, still partly restless, still carrying some inward momentum even as the house settled down around him. Herb Clutter had finished the practical work of the day and was moving toward night under the assumption that morning would bring more of the same. Farm business, schedules, responsibilities, the next measured task waiting on the far side of sleep. Bonnie Clutter remained within the fragile geography illness had imposed on her, more withdrawn from the motion of the house, but no less a part of its emotional weather. 4 people, 4 separate interiors of thought. One house moving carefully, almost ceremonially. Beyond the reach of the porch light, another movement had already begun to converge with theirs. Perry Smith and Richard Hickok had been traveling across Kansas with a plan that was at once specific and shapeless, as many terrible plans are. It had been born not out of grievance against the Clutters as people, but out of the thinner, uglier logic of imagined profit. A story had reached Dick Hickok in prison, passed along by former inmate Floyd Wells, that Herb Clutter kept a safe full of cash in his house. Whether Dick believed every detail hardly mattered. What mattered was that he wanted to believe enough. He wanted the fantasy of easy money waiting in a respectable farmhouse where a prosperous family slept behind unlocked trusts. Perry, carrying inside him his own unstable mixture of grievance, fantasy, humiliation, and damaged pride, came with him. Their journey across the plains was not dramatic in the way movies like to dramatize doom. It was colder, pettier, more ordinary, a car on a road, men talking in fragments, stops for gas, cigarette smoke, false confidence, boredom interrupted by flashes of anticipation. The country rolled past them in darkness, indifferent to their intentions, as they drove. The distance between idea and action narrowed mile by mile. Somewhere along the road, the crime still existed, mainly in language, in the casual hardening of resolve, in the raw convenience of thinking about victims as abstractions. But every mile also made the coming violence more real. The farmhouse was no longer a rumor. It was a destination. Holcomb itself had gone quiet by the time they approached. Small towns do not shut down all at once. They thin out. Last lights disappear from windows. Engines stop. Porch conversations end. The air grows wider, emptier. A place that seemed companionable in daylight becomes a scatter of sleeping structures under a sky too large to feel protective. Out on River Valley Farm, the house stood in its familiar isolation. Not lonely exactly, but separate in the way farmhouses always are. Dignified by distance in day and exposed by it at night to the men approaching. That separation must have looked like opportunity to the family inside. It still meant peace. The crime, when it began, did not erupt. It entered. That distinction matters. Violence in homes often starts with intrusion before it becomes injury. First, there is the crossing of a threshold that should not be crossed. Then the rearranging of space through fear. Then the collapse of ordinary rules. Dick and Perry came onto the property under cover of prairie darkness, carrying weapons and carrying with them the thin conviction that the house contained money enough to justify what they were prepared to do. The windows that had once signaled comfort now told them where life was still gathered. The same house that sheltered the family also revealed their presence in outline and glow. There are acts of violence born from frenzy, from sudden passion, from drunken escalation. This was something colder. It was planned enough to be deliberate, but not disciplined enough to remain controlled once reality failed to match fantasy. The men entered the Clutter home, and with that entry, the atmosphere of every room changed, even before the first overt act of brutality. A home ceases to be a home the moment strangers with weapons begin deciding where its inhabitants will stand, sit, move, or remain silent. Fear spreads faster than words in such moments. It changes the temperature of the air. It alters the weight of furniture, the width of hallways, the meaning of every stair. The Clutters, awakened or confronted, would have had only seconds to understand that the order governing their lives no longer applied. Men they did not know were inside their rooms. Questions were being asked with guns in hand. The ordinary protections of decency, reputation, and isolation had vanished all at once. One of the most haunting elements of the Clutter murders is the evidence that the family cooperated. There was no riot of broken objects, no wild struggle torn across the house. The scene later suggested compliance, restraint, confusion, and terror held in check by the hope that if the intruders got what they wanted, they might leave. That hope must have flickered from room to room like a weak light. Herb, practical even under pressure, may have tried to answer clearly, to satisfy questions, to direct the men toward whatever would end the danger. Nancy and Kenyon, young enough to still believe adults can negotiate reality back into shape, may have followed instructions because disobedience seemed unthinkable. Bonnie, vulnerable already, would have found herself pulled fully into a nightmare she had no strength to resist. There is a special horror in crimes where the victims are not targeted for who they are, but are simply caught at the mercy of men whose plan begins to fail, because that is what happened inside the Clutter house. There was no safe full of cash. There was no great reward waiting to rationalize the risk. The fantasy collapsed under the pressure of fact, and when violent men discover that reality has denied them what they came for, humiliation can become as dangerous as greed. The search for money turned into the management of witnesses. A robbery drained into something darker and more irreversible. The intruders moved members of the family into separate rooms, binding them, controlling them, turning the house into a map of dread. Each bedroom became an island. Each closed door carried the unbearable question of what was happening on the other side. Herb was taken to the basement, where the practical understructure of the home became the setting for his final minutes. Kenyon was left in another room, bound and helpless. Nancy was placed in her bedroom, the ordinary sanctuary of a teenage girl transformed into a place of mortal waiting. Bonnie was confined upstairs. The geography of the house, once arranged by family function and daily use, was reorganized according to the logic of the killers. That transformation is one of the hidden violences of home invasion. It desecrates not only bodies, but rooms. A bed is no longer for sleep. A basement is no longer storage and workspace. Stairs no longer connect generations within a household. They divide the living from the dying. What happened next unfolded in terrible sequence, but not, by every account, in blind chaos. Perry Smith, armed with a shotgun, became the principal killer. Dick Hickok, though he did not personally fire the fatal shots, participated fully in the terror that led to them and helped create the conditions in which no one in the house would survive. Their behavior that night carried the cowardice common to armed predation, the insistence on control over people who had offered none of the threat they claimed to fear. Herb Clutter was shot in the basement, a fatal blast delivered after he had been bound, rendered harmless, and denied even the dignity of facing an equal chance. Kenyon was shot where he lay helpless. Nancy, still in her room, was killed at close range. Bonnie, too, was murdered in the room where illness had already confined so much of her life. 4 victims. 4 killings. No fortune found. No real obstacle overcome. Only the final expression of men too morally broken to retreat once their fantasy had failed. The murders themselves took only a small slice of clock time. That is another unbearable truth. Years of life can be erased in minutes. A house can move from lamplit normality to irreversible silence in less time than it takes to drive to town. Yet inside those minutes, the victims would have experienced time differently. Fear distorts duration. Waiting in one room, while footsteps move elsewhere in the house, can feel endless. The scrape of a shoe in a hallway can stretch the mind to breaking. A voice heard through a wall becomes a lifeline and a torment at once. The clutter's final awareness likely came in fragments. Instructions, restraint, confusion, hope. Then the growing realization that no amount of compliance was restoring safety. In cases like this, terror is not only the instant of death, it is the period before it. When the victims understand that the people controlling them do not know how to leave without doing something worse, and then, almost as abruptly as they had entered, the killers left. They took what little money they had found, a pair of binoculars, a radio, and other small items so meager they seem obscene beside the scale of what had been destroyed. They drove away from River Valley Farm and back into the Kansas night, carrying with them no treasure. Only the residue of what they had done. Behind them, the house fell still. That stillness is difficult to imagine because houses are rarely ever truly silent while they hold life. They hum with plumbing. Footsteps, sleep. Settling boards, human presence. After the clutter murders, the stillness inside the home would have been of another order entirely. It would have sat in the rooms like cold metal. The bindings remained. The bodies remained. The night moved on outside, as if nothing in the order of the world had changed. Wind crossed the fields. The dark stayed dark. Somewhere far from the farm, someone laughed. Someone yawned. Someone turned off a lamp. Never suspecting that in one respectable Kansas farmhouse, a whole family had been extinguished. That contrast between cosmic indifference and domestic annihilation deepens the horror of the case. There was no storm to mark it, no visible tearing in the sky, no alarm that spread across the county at the moment the shots were fired. Violence happened in private, then sat hidden until daylight and routine drew others toward discovery. The incident ended not with pursuit, not with neighbors rushing in, but with absence. The killers were gone. The family could no longer call out. The house kept its secret until morning. What makes this part of the clutter story so difficult to tell is that the actual event was both brutally simple and emotionally vast. 2 men entered for money. They found almost none. Rather than leave with failure, they chose murder. The fact pattern can be stated in a few plain sentences, but inside those sentences lies the destruction of a moral universe. A father who had built his life on order died bound in his own basement. A mother already thinned by illness died in the room where she had sought whatever quiet she could still gather. A daughter at the edge of adulthood died in a bedroom that still held the signs of youth, and tomorrow, a son with his life still half-formed died before he could even test the shape of the man he might become. The crime was not only an act of killing, it was the violent cancellation of continuity. The cutting of every ordinary thread that had connected one Saturday night to the Sunday morning that should have followed it. By the time the sky above Holcomb began to pale, the incident itself was over. No one inside the house could witness dawn. The bedrooms, the basement, the stairs, the hallway, all remained where they had always been, unchanged in structure, altered forever in meaning. The farmhouse still stood in the same place, on the same land, beneath the same prairie sky. But it was no longer a home in the old sense. It had become a sealed container of death. Waiting for discovery, waiting for footsteps that would enter expecting routine and instead meet the stillness left by calculated human ruin. In later years, people would search that night for a missing sign. Some omen in the weather or in the behavior of the men, as if horror always leaves a visible shadow before it arrives. But the truth was harsher. The incident unfolded beneath the surface of ordinary life and remained there until morning exposed it. That is why the Clutter murders still feel so chilling. Nothing supernatural crossed the threshold. Only two men, a false story about money, a loaded shotgun, and the fatal decision that no innocent witness would be permitted to survive the failure of their plan. And in that small, merciless arithmetic, an entire family disappeared before Sunday began. Morning came to River Valley Farm with none of the violence written on its face. The sky over western Kansas lifted slowly from black to iron gray, then toward a brittle wash of pale light that made the harvested fields look cold and exposed. Frost clung to the ground in thin white traces where the sun had not yet reached, and the wind moved over the open land with the dry, cutting indifference typical of late autumn on the plains. From a distance, the Clutter house stood as it always had, composed and self-contained. Its shape familiar against the flat country, its windows reflecting daylight instead of giving anything away. There was no smoke, no broken wall, no dramatic sign visible from the road that anything inside had changed. That was one of the cruelest features of the morning. The house still looked like a house. The farm still looked like a farm. The land had not shifted to acknowledge what the night had taken. It waited in silence while ordinary Sunday expectations brought the first unsuspecting footsteps toward the door. In communities like Holcomb, Sunday carried its own emotional texture. It was a day of church, cleaned shoes, pressed clothes, quieter hours, and an assumed rhythm that gathered families toward worship and toward one another. The Clutters were not the sort of family people expected to miss such a morning without explanation. Their absences would have been noticed because their lives had pattern, and people who live by pattern leave a visible blank when they fail to appear. Nancy Clutter, especially, had social and church obligations that made her reliability part of how the town understood her. So when morning advanced and she was not where she was expected to be, concern did not begin as panic. It began as mild confusion, then hesitation, then the first uneasy feeling that routine had slipped. A friend of Nancy's, Susan Kidwell, looking for her before church, made her way to the Clutter home with another girl, Nancy Ewalt. They arrived carrying the light assumptions of ordinary adolescence, perhaps expecting to find Nancy delayed, still dressing, still moving through the last-minute rush of a Sunday morning. There is something devastating in that image. Two girls approaching a familiar house with the innocence of friendship, unaware that within minutes the architecture of their understanding of safety would be permanently altered. The door was unlocked. That fact later seemed to contain the entire moral injury of the case. In Holcomb, unlocked doors belonged to trust. They belonged to a way of living in which danger was thought to exist elsewhere, farther away. In cities, among strangers. In places with different rules, Susan and Nancy stepped inside not as investigators, not as people braced for horror, but as girls entering a known household. The interior would have seemed quiet in a way that first registered only as odd. A Sunday morning quiet is not unusual in itself. Families sleep late. People move softly. Radios stay low. Yet there is a difference between ordinary quiet and the silence of a house where no one living remains to answer. Human beings sense that difference before they can name it. Rooms feel withheld. Air feels still in a way that does not belong to life. Small sounds fail to arrive. No voice calls out from another room. No footstep answers. No chair scrapes lightly against a floor. The girls moved further in, their unease gathering shape. What they saw first would stay with them forever. In Bonnie Clutter's room, the body of Nancy Clutter was visible on the bed. The shock of that sight cannot be fully translated into language because it involved not only the visual recognition of death, but the immediate collapse of every expectation the girls had carried into the house. Nancy was not a rumor or a cautionary tale. She was their friend. someone who had existed the previous day in the familiar scale of teenage life. To encounter her like that, suddenly unreachable, transformed by violence inside the sanctuary of her own home, was to have youth itself interrupted by something mercilessly adult and irreversible. Susan ran from the house in terror, crying that Nancy was dead. What followed in those first moments was confusion, alarm, and the rapid spread of a truth so monstrous it outran anyone's ability to comprehend it. Authorities were summoned. Neighbors began to gather at a distance, drawn by urgency, and then held back by the atmosphere that settles around a place once death has been named inside it. The first law officer on the scene was Under Sheriff Wendell Meyer, soon followed by Sheriff Earl Robinson and other investigators. Their work began in that difficult space between disbelief and procedure. Every seasoned officer knows that the first minutes inside a homicide scene matter enormously, but even experience does not erase the human impact of entering a family home and finding not one victim, but signs that the entire household may have been extinguished. The Clutter House did not present itself at first as a chaotic slaughter site. It was, in many ways, more disturbing than that. The rooms were not torn apart in frenzy. Furniture stood largely where it belonged. There were no obvious signs of a broad struggle, no dramatic wreckage to help the mind absorb what had occurred through visible disorder. Instead, there was arrangement, separation, restraint. It was the orderliness of the scene that deepened the horror because it suggested control. Someone had moved through the house deliberately. Someone had taken time. Someone had directed living human beings into different rooms, bound them, and killed them one by one. The investigators began with Bonnie's room, where her body and Nancy's were found. Bonnie lay in bed, shot in the head. Nancy, too, had been shot at close range. She wore a nightgown and robe, details that made the scene feel even more intimate and unbearable. These were not people dragged into a public confrontation. They had been taken from the private, domestic space of sleep and illness. The room itself would have still carried the visual language of family life: blankets, furniture, perhaps personal items on a table. The ordinary arrangement of a bedroom that only hours before had belonged to daily existence rather than evidence. That contrast between domestic familiarity and mortal violence created the emotional charge of the house. Every object remained itself and yet had become implicated in something hideous. A bed was still a bed, but now it held a body. A doorway was still a doorway, but now it framed the final terror that had crossed it. The search of the rest of the house revealed the full extent of the killings. Kenyon Clutter was found in a room on the lower level, bound and shot. Herbert Clutter was discovered in the basement, also bound, his throat cut and his head destroyed by a shotgun blast. The basement scene in particular communicated both calculation and unnecessary savagery. Herb had been subdued, rendered harmless, and then killed with a force that suggested not panic, but the final assertion of absolute power by someone who feared no resistance and no immediate interruption. The bindings found on the victims became some of the most important early clues. Rope and cord had been used to restrain members of the family. The knots, placement, and differing methods of restraint told investigators that the victims had been controlled systematically, likely separated to prevent resistance and noise. This was not the work of a single explosion of violence at the front door. It was a managed crime, a home invasion that had evolved into execution, and yet the scene also raised immediate questions. If this was a robbery, where was the evidence of a frantic search for valuables? Drawers were not everywhere upended. Closets had not been gutted indiscriminately. The house did not display the wild footprint of thieves tearing through a prosperous farmhouse in search of money. Some rooms appeared almost untouched. That detail troubled investigators from the beginning because it suggested either that the killers knew exactly what they wanted and had not needed to search broadly, or that they had expected to find something specific, failed to find it, and then left after the murders. Initial assessments of the crime scene quickly ruled out several easy explanations. This did not look like a murder born from domestic conflict. There was no surviving spouse, no embittered child, no drunken family dispute erupting into bloodshed, nor did it look like a random transient burglary in which intruders had stumbled recklessly into violence. Too much had been controlled, too much had been methodical. The house had not been indiscriminately vandalized. The victims had been handled with terrifying purpose. It appeared that at least 2 killers had been involved, though this was still a working inference rather than certainty in the earliest hours. One person could perhaps bind multiple victims under threat of a weapon, but the movement through the house, the management of rooms, the logistics of controlling 4 people suggested more than one offender. The discovery of the bodies also carried a grim procedural burden. The officers had to secure the scene while the wider community, stunned and increasingly frightened, began to realize that something unprecedented had happened in their midst. News travels fast in small towns, but it does not always travel clearly. By late morning, Holcomb and nearby Garden City were already alive with rumor, grief, and dread. People asked each other versions of the same impossible question: who would do this to the Clutters? That question mattered not only because the family was admired, but because if the Clutters could be murdered in their home, then the old assumptions of local safety had ruptured for everyone. The crime scene fed that fear. There was no immediate, obvious suspect, no public scandal to point toward, no known enemy, no sign that the victims had invited danger into their lives through some whispered double life. The clean lines of the family's reputation made the violence look even more alien. For investigators, the first physical clues were frustratingly sparse. There were footprints, but the house and surrounding areas did not yield an easy trail that could rapidly identify the killers. The murder weapon was missing. There was evidence of shotgun use, but no gun had been left behind. The killers had taken it with them, along with whatever shell evidence or direct trace might have tied them immediately to the scene. Certain small items were missing from the home, including a portable radio and binoculars, along with a little cash. The amount stolen appeared insultingly small given the scale of the crime. That fact reinforced the emerging theory that the intruders had expected more. It also suggested a particularly bleak psychological landscape behind the murders. 4 lives had been taken not for a fortune, not to settle a meaningful vendetta, but in the wake of a failed search for money that turned out scarcely to exist. Investigators also noted that Herb's wallet had not yielded the kind of large cash reserves some might have imagined a successful farmer kept on hand. There was no hidden trove, no safe full of currency. In a paradox that would later become central to the case, the absence of money became a clue in itself. It suggested that the killers may have come with false or exaggerated information about what they expected to find. If so, then somewhere outside the house existed a source of that information. Someone may have told them that this particular farm, this particular family, was worth targeting. Among the earliest and most emotionally resonant details was the apparent lack of forced entry. That detail echoed like a rebuke through the investigation and through the national reaction that followed. Whether the intruders had entered through an unlocked door or gained compliance quickly enough that damage was minimal, the result was the same. The house had not been fortified against attack because its occupants did not live in a state of fear. That vulnerability, so natural in Holcomb before the murders, became one of the invisible clues of the case. It told investigators something about the setting as much as the crime. The killers had exploited a culture of trust. As agents from the Kansas Bureau of Investigation joined the local authorities, the scene began to be read not just emotionally but analytically. Blood patterns, body positions, bindings, room conditions, and missing items were all considered within the same emerging framework. The victims had almost certainly been awakened and then controlled. There was little indication of resistance, which suggested that the family had remained compliant under threat, likely hoping to survive. Each had then been killed deliberately. The sequence of deaths was still uncertain in those first hours, but the overall design of the crime was chillingly clear. This had not been spontaneous slaughter in a single room. It was a progression, a movement through the house that combined practical control with moral emptiness. As the day wore on, the Clutter home changed in public perception from a respected farmhouse to the center of a mystery. Photographs were taken, measurements were made. Officers moved through rooms that still held traces of domestic life alongside traces of violence. Outside, cars gathered, faces turned pale with speculation. People who had known the family now had to wait while strangers in official coats and hats translated their home into evidence. That translation is one of the colder necessities of homicide investigation. Beds become locations, knots become indicators. Family photographs on walls become background to wound trajectories and timelines. Yet beneath that process, the emotional truth remained inescapable. 4 people had been killed in a house that still smelled, likely, of ordinary living. The discovery had not just uncovered death. It had exposed the terrible ease with which evil had crossed into an admired and seemingly protected life. By the end of that first day, investigators possessed a set of facts and almost no comforting interpretation. 4 Clutters were dead. They had been bound and shot. The scene suggested robbery, but not one that had yielded much. There was no obvious personal motive. No immediate suspect loomed clearly over the evidence. The house itself, despite containing the clues that would eventually matter, initially offered more questions than answers. That is why the discovery phase of the Clutter murders remains so haunting. It is not only the sight of the victims or the shock to the community. It is the way the early clues pointed simultaneously toward intention and emptiness, toward planning without profit, toward control without reason that ordinary people could easily understand. The crime scene seemed to whisper that someone had come to the house carrying a plan built on false information and had chosen murder when reality refused to cooperate. That insight was still dim in those first hours, but it was already there in outline. Embedded in the calm arrangement of rooms, the spare theft, the missing weapon, the bindings, the lack of a broad search, and the terrible silence that had lasted all the way until Sunday morning. Holcomb had awakened expecting church bells and ordinary conversation. Instead, it found itself staring into a farmhouse where routine had ended in methodical death, and where the first clues, though real, were not yet enough to tell anyone who had brought the darkness to River Valley Farm. In the days immediately after the murders, Holcomb and the surrounding county entered a state that was not quite panic and not quite grief, but something unstable in between, a condition in which every ordinary gesture seemed to have acquired a second meaning. People still drove to work, still opened stores, still fed livestock, still attended church and school. Yet beneath those motions ran a harder current of apprehension. Front doors that had once stood unlocked began closing with intention. Curtains were drawn a little earlier in the evening. Men who had never made a habit of checking windows before bed found themselves circling the house one last time in the dark. Women listened for engines on the road after sundown and felt their breathing change when an unfamiliar car passed too slowly. The Clutter murders had not simply removed 4 lives from a respected family. They had punctured the emotional logic of the place. Holcomb had believed, without needing to say it aloud, that danger belonged elsewhere. Now the elsewhere had arrived in their own bedrooms, and no one could yet say from where. For the investigators, that atmosphere created both urgency and distortion. Sheriff Earl Robinson, Under Sheriff Wendell Meyer, and the Kansas Bureau of Investigation were now working under a pressure that extended far beyond the practical need to solve a quadruple homicide. They had to restore coherence to a community that no longer trusted its own assumptions. The problem was that the case, for all its brutality, had offered very little that could be easily converted into a suspect. The Clutter family had no obvious enemies. Herb Clutter was known as a fair employer and a serious man, not one given to shady business, drunken fights, or personal vendettas that might erupt into bloodshed. There were no signs that Nancy or Kenyon had drawn some hidden threat toward the household through secret troubles of their own. Bonnie, living under the strain of illness, was even less likely to have been the center of any conspiracy. The victims, in other words, did not help explain their own murders. Investigators were forced to work from the crime scene outward into emptiness. And emptiness is one of the most frustrating things a case can offer. The first rounds of inquiry followed every logical path available. Officers spoke to neighbors, farm hands, business associates, friends, and extended family members. They traced the family's last known movements, looking for anything unusual in the day or evening before the murders. They asked about debts, resentments, strangers seen on roads, odd noises in the night, missing property, and recent interactions that might have seemed trivial at the time, but could now matter. Yet one of the paradoxes of the Clutter case was that the family's very respectability produced a desert of motive. People did not come forward with stories of heated conflict. They came forward instead with praise, with recollections of reliability, with the repeated insistence that the Clutters were good people and that what had happened made no sense. Good character can be morally meaningful, but it is not an investigative lead. The crime scene itself still seemed to support the theory of robbery, but even that theory contained a problem that investigators could not resolve in the early going. A robbery for what? Only a small amount of money had been taken. Along with a few portable items, the house had not been ransacked in the broad, reckless manner of intruders searching everywhere for hidden wealth. The killers appeared to have expected something more specific, or something larger, and had not found it. That suggested prior information. But information from whom? If someone had targeted River Valley Farm believing Herb Clutter kept a safe or large cash reserves, then somewhere there had to be a source for that belief. Yet no such source presented itself immediately. And no one in the local orbit of the family seemed likely to imagine the Clutters as people who stored fortunes in the house. As the days passed, investigators began to encounter the most dangerous companion of unsolved violence in a close community: suspicion without direction. In places where people know one another by face, family, and habit, fear does not remain abstract for long. It starts looking for names. Rumors rose quickly and attached themselves to whatever seemed just plausible enough to be repeated in a hushed voice. A drifter seen on a road, a former employee remembered as resentful, a stranger at a gas station, a car parked oddly near town, a young man with the wrong kind of stare. The details shifted depending on who was telling them. But the emotional structure remained the same. People wanted the murders to belong to someone imaginable, someone already near the edges of community trust. That impulse is understandable. But it creates noise, and noise can bury a case as effectively as silence. Investigators chased down tips that led nowhere. They questioned people whose only crime was bad luck or poor timing. Every uncertain memory acquired new weight after the murders, and every new weight had to be tested. Men with criminal records were examined. Local transients were considered. Stories were checked, discounted, revived, and checked again. The investigation widened geographically, because whoever had done this had likely come from outside the immediate emotional circle of the Clutters. Yet widening the map also multiplied the number of possibilities. This was western Kansas, crossed by highways, farm roads, and long distances that could hide movement simply by dispersing it across too much land. A pair of killers could have been in and out before anyone realized a crime had occurred. That fact lent the investigation a particular bleakness. The murderers might not be hiding nearby at all. They might already be hundreds of miles away, carrying with them a secret the prairie could not expose. There was also the matter of professional pride and institutional limitation. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation brought broader resources and experience. But even experienced investigators in 1959 worked without the forensic advantages later generations would take for granted. There was no instant database to compare fingerprints or movements across jurisdictions in real time. No digital trail of purchases or phone records that could be assembled in hours. No easy surveillance network to reconstruct a path. The investigators had evidence, certainly, and they had reasoning, but reasoning in such a case often feels like building a bridge across fog. One fact supports another, but the structure still hangs over open space. Agent Harold Nye became one of the central figures pushing the case forward, methodical, thoughtful, and persistent in a landscape increasingly crowded with emotional static. He understood that the murders contained an internal logic, however warped. The problem was not that there was no logic. The problem was that the logic belonged to minds still hidden from view. In the meantime, the social damage in Holcomb kept spreading. Families who had once spoken casually over fences now looked harder at passing vehicles. Farmhouses that had represented dignity and privacy began to seem exposed. Children noticed that adults were speaking more softly or more sharply than before. The clutter murders had inserted a crack into the moral confidence of the area. And that crack widened each day the killers remained unidentified. The dead became almost less frightening than the unknown men who had killed them. Because the unknown could still be out there, still moving through roads and diners and motels with the same cold freedom they had possessed on the night of the crime. That fear pressed on the investigation from the outside, while from the inside, a different frustration was taking hold. Each new lead seemed to dissolve under scrutiny. Former employees of Herb Clutter were looked at because robbery appeared to be part of the motive, and because employees might know the routines of the farm. But interviews yielded no one who seemed capable of the crime or connected in any meaningful way to the evidence. People close to Nancy were considered, if only because murders involving young women often trigger reflexive suspicion around romance or jealousy. Yet nothing in her life suggested a hidden relationship or local conflict that could explain the slaughter of her entire family. Business angles were explored and gave little. Herb Clutter was respected, organized, and not entangled in criminal dealings. His public life was too clean to offer investigators the sort of dark undercurrent that sometimes reveals motive. The crime scene, 2. Continued to resist simplification.